The first Adventist, Seventh-day Adventist church school teacher, full-time church school teacher in California, was a lady named Mrs. Alma McKibben. Mrs. McKibben rented Ellen White's house. When Ellen White went to Australia, Ellen White owned a home in Healdsburg, California. When she came back from Australia, she decided not to live in Healdsburg, but instead to buy a home over by the sanitarium, St. Helena Sanitarium. So Mrs. McKibben rented Ellen White's house. On one occasion, Mrs. McKibben said she never was a good sleeper. She couldn't sleep well at night. And on this particular occasion, she was not feeling well at all. So she traveled from Healdsburg over to the St. Helena Sanitarium, hoped to get in, but the sanitarium was full. They had no beds open. So until a bed opened up, she stayed with one of Ellen White's secretaries, Miss Sarah Peck. And Miss Peck lived in a little cottage just, well, if you're facing Elmshaven, it would be to the right. And so Mrs. McKibben said, there I was at night. I was on a couch or sofa, something, right in the front room. And I could look right out the window, right up at Ellen White's house. And she said, I felt so miserable. I just didn't feel good at all. And early hours of the morning, she said, there was a light came on in the Ellen White's writing room. And so she said, even though I knew that Sister White didn't know that I was there, just knowing that somebody else at least was awake on the place made me feel a little bit better. Now, she said Ellen White, of course, believed in fresh air, so she had all of her windows there in Elmshaven open. And she said Miss Peck also tried to practice that part of our health message, so she had her windows open. And she said through the night air, she heard something that she had never heard before or since, anything like it. And that was Ellen White pray. She said Ellen White prayed out loud. Well, we have other records of her praying her private prayers out loud. So the story makes sense from other records that we have. But she said Mrs. White began to pray. And she said it was not our Father, it was my Father. She said it was such an earnest prayer. She said, I've never heard anything like it. Now, if you know anything about Mrs. McKibben was a real Bible student. In fact, she wrote some of our very earliest Bible textbooks. She was a Bible scholar. And she said, I used to read in the Bible about the burden that Isaiah or the burden that Jeremiah carried for the people of God. But she said, I never, until that evening, that night, she said, I never really understood what it was for a prophet to carry a burden for an entire people. She said, oh, we all carry burdens for our loved ones, our family members. But she said that night, as Ellen White began to pray, she said she began to implore God, earnestly pray to God, that he would stand by and help keep the leaders of this church faithful, that they would never succumb to some of the temptations that come along to deviate from the truth. And she said how she prayed that God would help the leaders of this church to remain faithful. And then she said after she had prayed earnestly on behalf of the leaders of the church, she began to pray for the ministers, the men who stand week after week in the pulpit. And she said she prayed most earnestly that God would keep the ministers faithful, that they would preach only truth from the pulpits of our churches. And she said after she had prayed some time for the pastors of this church, she prayed for the teachers, the men and the women that are standing in our classrooms and are trying to lead young people to Jesus. She said how she prayed so earnestly that God would stand by them as they are trying to preach or to teach these young people and to lead by example these young people to give their hearts to Jesus. She said, as long as I live, and she lived to be over 100 years old when she finally died, she said, I'll never forget that prayer that night there as I was waiting to get a room in the St. Helena Sanitarium, hearing Ellen White pray one-on-one when she did not know anyone was listening. This was not a public prayer. She thought she was the only one besides God that was listening, praying on behalf of this church. She said that was the first time she had just a small inkling of what it is for a prophet to carry a burden for an entire church.